army doesn't like more than one disaster in a day.
Looks bad in the newspapers and upset civilians at their breakfast.
I'm Bill Bupert, retired Army officer and irregular warfare practitioner and scholar. Welcome to Chasing Ghosts, an irregular warfare podcast, the show that examines the mythos, lost history, bad thinking, martial malpractice, and government incompetence that informs so much of irregular warfare. Today I want to peek behind the curtain at the vast machinery and briar patch politics of insurgency and counterinsurgency and everything in between. Now, let's go ghost hunting together. Hello, and welcome to Chasing Ghosts, an irregular warfare podcast. Today's episode is episode 85. Home is the High Ground, Reimagining a New Hermit Kingdom. So, it's been a while since I have conversed with you guys. It's been 1 month instead of the fortnightly cadence that I have in the issuance of these episodes. It has been time for vacation, reorganization, moving, reconstitution, and just taking a little bit of a break. So today, I think that you're going to really enjoy this particular podcast. We're probably going to be all over the map. And, of course, as usual, a little housekeeping is in order. Yes, indeed, I have had many requests on, Bill, when are you going to cover what happened in German East Africa during the First World War, in which we had our General Paul Emil Leto Vorbeck being the only undefeated German general standing on Earth, as it were, November 11th, 1918. So that being the case, I have been researching that particular thing, and I do promise you, before the end of this calendar year, you will get an episode or two or three on this very enigmatic, if underrepresented figure in historiography of military history. Just came off a cruise with my good friend SL. He and I have been friends forever, nearly a quarter century. Ironically enough, we met on a range while we were in the Legions and have been inseparable since in a variety of fashions. He happens to be one of the most competent gunsmith and fabbers that I know. He's quite a great shooter, and we had a great time where here we are trapped on this very large ship. I will never cruise again, by the way. And we got a lot of time to spend together because he now lives in a different state than I do. We used to live in the same state. That is no longer the case. So it was great to see him and his lovely bride. My lovely bride was along for the ride, and a good time was had by us, but not so much on the cruise. And that's because people suck. I've lived by that potent observation all of my adult life, and I've noticed that my disappointment is not as great because I have no expectation beyond my circle of friends, family, colleagues, and some acquaintances. So I can automatically assume that those people I make will be of a lower caliber quality and that their behavior will disappoint me. And as always, if you wish to get in touch with me, you can email me at cgpodcast@pm.me. That is cgpodcast@pm.me. This will be in the show notes, along with a variety of book citations and research citations for this very episode today. I also urge you to join my Substack. Just go find Chasing Ghost with my name. This will also be in the show notes. If you become a paid subscriber, then I am forever in your debt. If you simply become a free subscriber, I am also in your debt because one of the primary reasons why I even started that Substack was commentary on my podcast bloviations. And there's an opportunity for you to give me comments, questions, things like that. All I ask is that one, retain a gentlemanly comportment and refuse the ad hominem imperative that seems to animate so many government supremacists who don't like my anti-communist stances and such. This particular episode will be live in the world on 6th July, and I am hoping ahead of time that you had a wonderful Revolution Day weekend, and to keep in mind that your ancestors shot tax collectors in the face. So over at my occasional companion podcast, War Notes, on which one could argue this episode should very well be placed there instead, but my inherent laziness over the weekend has forced me to do otherwise. I've spoken of how to fix the Department of War, how to fix the U.S. government, how to fix foreign policy, suggestions and recommendations not on staying the present course, but on changing course to a future in which wars of choice are not conducted. The United States is not the planet's busybody trying to impose through military means and even financial means the direction in which other individual countries conduct themselves. I mean, at last reading, I think that there were over 220 countries around the planet. Who knows, maybe there's more of them. Our wretched United Nations probably keeps track of that, but not in a good way. As I've mentioned before, since 1945 and the conclusion of the war to save Joseph Stalin, in which the Russians bested the Germans and the United States bested the Japanese in an informal partnership of political convenience to make sure that FDR's desires to make the world safe for communist domination after the conclusion of the war, the deal could be sealed, as it were. Since that time, America has a sterling track record of stalemate and defeat since that time in all of these wars of choice. Yes, in my mind, Korea was a war of choice. Vietnam was a war of choice. Fast forward to the wars of choice under the Nobel Peace Prize winner Barack Obama, in which not only did he refuse his campaign promises of getting out of Afghanistan and Iraq, but he opened new United States war fronts in Libya, Yemen, and Syria, and the Horn of Africa. It goes on and continues, and the Department of War continues to engage in this form of galactic martial malpractice at the behest, of course, of the Congress, the executive, and their own machinations that take place within the Congress itself. No, I am not a member of either left wing of the Uniparty, the Democrats or the Republicans, but for those who think that the Democrats are the peace party, I offer you as Exhibit A from the 20th century only, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Somalia, and Serbia as the primary evidence that the Democrats are the primary war party in America. So you may be really curious, well, what the heck is that title about, Bill, for this episode? Well, what it's about is it's time for us not to become isolationists, even though I don't think that isolationism is a four-letter word. It is time for us to become non-interventionist, much as the Swiss, where we export goods and services abroad in exchange for monies, of course, or maybe barter at times, and we do not export violence, whether retail or wholesale. So look, someone can come up with a snappy name for this tactical, operational, strategic, and grand strategic realignment that I am suggesting, recommending, and proposing here. They'll probably come up with something that bears itself on ad copy in a much more compelling fashion than I am, but we're simply going to call it the American Reset. And in this case, what I am suggesting is that America withdraw from the global hegemony business entirely. Now, I've touched on this in the past, especially in the 20-odd episodes of my War Notes Conflict podcast, but I wanted to sort of condense, compress, and talk about it in a single episode here on what that would mean. This kind of retrenchment, this kind of strategic withdrawal, not a retreat, but a withdrawal. Nothing would stop us from continuing to peacefully cooperate through persuasion and markets in the trading of goods and services, as I mentioned earlier, for remuneration, of course, and that with the sacking of the USAID money laundering complex, and before 2022, The Ukraine acted as a very large money laundering modality, but the Russians took care of that after 2022, and other means had to be found by the usual suspects, the non-government organizations, to fund their money laundering and fraud schemes and color revolution schemes around the world. The main reason non-government organizations exist is to facilitate that kind of money laundering and to facilitate the kind of regime and governmental changes abroad that government supremacists are very fond of. I've often said that the deep state assumed singularity with a capital S in March 1933 with the FDR administration, and with a slight abeyance, if not slowing down, of that acceleration during the Eisenhower years. And then, of course, from 1960 onward, and especially from November 1963 onward, the United States essentially became a color revolution and war factory on the planet for the remainder of the 20th century. And then, of course, with 9/11, wherever you may come down on that, and the general war on terror against the axis of terror in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, Syria, and all the rest of the places, we, being the United States, have been engaged in this military export facilitation planet-wide. And it doesn't make our forces stronger, it doesn't make us better, it doesn't make us more effective, and it drains the treasury by the tens of trillions of dollars over generations. So I'm proposing a reset. I'm proposing that as a global hegemon, we have failed terribly, and that as a global hegemon which inevitably installs government supremacist, socialist, and communist governments around the world, that doesn't do us any good at home in the long run, nor does it do our children, grandchildren, and even our unborn heirs any good because of all the unintended consequences that are going to emerge from the United States screwing around with the world and peoples around the earth. I try to keep it PG here, try to keep it family friendly, but one of my favorite notions is that Newton's third law is a stone cold motherfracker. And I do think at every level of reaction that all the chickens are coming home to roost. So my suggestion to this administration or any regime that comes into power at the federal level is that let's stop, pause, take a knee, drink water, and reassess our engagement and our interference with the world and see if, in the end, these low-density lobbies for planetary color revolution emanating from the intelligence communities, Foggy Bottoms, and all of those NGOs who seek to make the world much more Leninist, Stalinist, and Hitlerite than it actually is, maybe, just maybe, that's not beneficial to America in the long run. My ask is we become a regional hegemon. Now, the reason that would be my ask, instead of isolating ourselves to the borders north to Canada and the borders south to Mexico and just minding our own business, is because I just don't think America is set up to mind its own business. So what I seek to do is find a way to limit the damage of not minding your own business and confining ourselves to our own respective hemisphere here, as was championed by James Monroe with the Monroe Doctrine, where he made it clear to the planet in the 19th century that the Europeans and other interlopers in the Western Hemisphere, which would include, of course, from the top of Canada to Tierra del Fuego in Latin America, that you're not wanted here. We don't want you to take part in anything going on here, and that if you do, you are interfering in the peaceful national security sphere that America erected for itself something like an existential force field from north to south, east to west, from the Pacific to the Atlantic coasts. I have radical proposals, and we'll go over some of those. I happen to think that all the services need to realign themselves to the new reality that there's no such thing as a near peer or third world or developing country threat, that because of UAVs, FPVs, AI, very fast hypervelocity munitions and such, all of these nations are peer competitors to the United States, which means that because the United States has been silly enough to make the centerpiece of all of its war-making planet-wide, for the most part, around very expensive, individual, exquisite platforms, that all of those can be destroyed or sunk in detail. Now, I have bored my audience with my notions of why I think carriers are the crossbow and cherry of the 21st century, and we should retire them immediately tomorrow morning. Stop spending that money and make them into the fish apartments that they have always been designed to be in this century. If not, I would suggest directly after 1945, because 1942 to 1945 was the golden age of the aircraft carrier. There's no doubt that in the Pacific theater of operations, the Japanese could not have been defeated without naval aviation. And of course, the Japanese know this because from 1939 to 1942, the premier naval aviation component on planet Earth was Kito Butai, Japanese naval aviation, their tactics, their operational capability, and their carriers. But by 43 and 44, as a result of America's industrial base and those kind of things, the superiority, the absolute dominance of American carrier forces and aviation forces, not to mention Army aviation in the Pacific, were so massive and so huge that by 1944, the Japanese did not have a chance of stopping the inexorable advancement of what James Hornfisher has called a maritime civilization erected from the west coast of America to the shores of Japan. And I paraphrase when I say that. R.I.P. James Hornfisher, we lost you too soon. So if we dispose of that, and you have regional hegemons like China and Russia, possibly India, possibly a confabulation or a coalition of Middle Eastern states, why can't they have their piece of the pie without American upper management being there to supervise and micromanage them in the administration of what they consider to be their regional hegemonic priorities? Why can't Iran be a regional hegemon? Well, you can't say it can't because it is a regional hegemon. I think if the world, especially America, especially the West, especially the Europeans, were to take into account that regional hegemons have always been a reality now for 10,000 years in human history, and you can't abate that, why not respect it? Why not find a way around it? Why not flow around that instead of constantly trying to reimagine and bludgeon into being something that cannot happen? You cannot have nation states or nation state alliances, whether you consider them allied or axis, forming one another and not being concerned for what they're doing in their regional localities. This is going to startle a lot of my listeners, but I've thought this through, and why can't Iran have nuclear weapons? So Iran boasts of using nuclear weapons against another state or states, either in defense of itself or it simply feels like doing it. And you're telling me that since 1962 out of Dimona that the Israelis have not made the same threats, that the United States has not made the same threat? It was Eisenhower who made that very threat in the 1950s against Iraq, that he was considering using nuclear weapons. This is the same 1950s United States that saw President Eisenhower come in with 50 usable nuclear weapons at the start of that decade, ending in approximately 12,000 by the end. I am not saying here that I am in favor of nuclear Armageddon or anything like that, but you cannot wish away or de-invent, is there such a word? They're here. They had to be dealt with. My suggestion for Iran is that Iran tomorrow morning goes to the United Nations, wretched be thy name, or the International Atomic Energy Agency, and when it comes to the International Non-Proliferation Treaty for Nuclear Weapons, the IPT, of which Israel is not a member and hasn't been a member since the 1960s, and they simply say, we are going to pursue an atomic weapon, whether we build it ourselves or lease it from somebody else, maybe in that evil axis that's called BRICS right now, and we'll be happy to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty organization, which brokers inspections internally on the state of said weapons and such within the country proper, if Israel will meet us at the table in a nice, luxurious conference room in Geneva, Switzerland, where we will sign on to this. So as long as the Israelis allow their Dimona facilities and elsewhere to be subject to international inspection from the IAEA, we will do the same. I really do think that that would go a long way towards brokering, if not a peace, a much more stable stalemate in the Middle East than we have right now. And by the way, with Iran, why can't they charge tolls on the Strait of Hormuz? Why can't they do what they please as the regional hegemon there? Why must the United States insist that those open sea lines of communication, which, by the way, American carriers have been unable to keep open, along with all American surface naval forces, why can't they do that? Why can't they charge a toll? As a matter of fact, why can't America uncork all of its drill and well capacity domestically in America? And then guess what? America, and this speaks to the theme of this very episode, would not have to endanger a single American life in war or peace in the Middle East, because we wouldn't need Middle Eastern oil, because we would be not only domestically satisfied with the consumption levels that we would have here in the United States proper if we open the drills and open the wells, but we'd also be able to sell it elsewhere. And all of a sudden, if we were to untap the vast resources, not only in America, but throughout the Western Hemisphere, remember that Venezuela is literally at sea over an ocean of oil reserves that they have available to tap. As Peter Fromkin told us in the book, The War to End All Wars, about what happened after World War I, when all of a sudden from 1918 to 1920, Winston Churchill and the usual suspects carved up nice geometric right angles all over the map in the Middle East, ignoring clan, blood, faction, previous alliances that are generations old, and simply saying, this is your country. Oh, by the way, that is your country. And of course, what it did is it uncorked at the conclusion of the larger war, World War I, all of these microaggressions and simmering embers of previous civil wars in those nations, and allowed them to get the oxygen they needed to become alive again and form the roots of new wars around the world. And of course, World War II really put the pedal to the metal with the decolonization that happened from 1945 to 1960, that also started to see nation states planet-wide settling their scores as their oxygenated embers turned into brush fire wars and wildfires. When it comes to the Pacific pivot, as it were, our wonderful allies, for instance, in South Korea and Japan, and maybe even Taiwan, even though I would sort of carve out a special place for them. For me, it's neither here nor there. What we do with Taiwan, that's up to the Taiwanese. But the very idea that we have to not only have this nuclear umbrella, but this conventional response available for said Pacific pivot with all of these surface warfare vessels that don't work, like the Zumwalt, like the carrier, the Ford that cannot reliably launch or retrieve aircraft, or the little crappy ships and things like that. America, from a surface naval perspective, doesn't have a prayer when it comes to defeating a Chinese invasion of the Taiwan mainland. Will the Chinese suffer under American weapons? Most certainly. Will American weapon systems and especially exquisite platforms suffer? Absolutely. Why can't the Japanese have nuclear weapons? Why can't the South Koreans have nuclear weapons? Taiwan would be something I'd have to put in my pipe and smoke it and consider it and see whether I think that the issuance and subsidy of nuclear weapons in their arsenal would be beneficial or deleterious to American foreign policy. I don't have the answer to that right now, but I do have the answer for Japan and South Korea. They need nukes. If they had nukes, what we discover is that nukes are a very large dissuader in the invasion of a country. It is the North Korean nuclear weapons that have kept America from invading North Korea. It has kept South Korea from invading North Korea, or vice versa. As a matter of fact, I think that if I read the NPT when I was getting ready for this episode, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, they said something like 60 or 90 days would be required to withdraw from the NPT. If I recall, I think the North Koreans withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which means that they do not have inspectors coming aboard their country to investigate and assess their nuclear weapons stockpiles. They did it over a 72-hour period of time. If I recall, I think it was the South Africans who detonated their first nuclear weapon in 1977 over the Atlantic in a test, are probably the only country on Earth, besides possibly Libya. Libya was on the cusp. The only country on Earth that actually dismantled their entire nuclear inventory. I'm thankful for that because after 1993 to 1995, with the defeat of the apartheid regime, the white apartheid regime, that apartheid regime was replaced by a black apartheid regime. And as a result of that, I can only shiver at thinking of the present South African National Defense Force having nuclear weapons and what they would do with them. If I recall, I think Pakistan, of all the nuclear weapons powers on Earth, is the one that actually separates their rockets from their warheads before they're going to use them. The reason I'm discussing this is because I would suggest that we have these alliances, but we only assure them with nuclear guarantees and not conventional guarantees, and localize those nuclear guarantees to those respective countries and let those countries have their own nuclear weapons at their disposal and not simply ours. Now, if we look at the Atlantic, there's something very curious going on there. I happen to think that in a generation, the United Kingdom, with London being the only first world city in what is essentially a third world country, that is the United Kingdom, they have an SLBM, a submarine launched ballistic missile capability, in their aging and awful submarine force, their SSBN force, that actually, and I know I'm going to get pushback on this because I'll say, but they don't lease it from us. We own those nuclear weapons. All those nuclear warheads are leased from America and serviced by American defense contractors, both there and here in America. Now, the reason I bring that up is because while I am all for the Japanese having nuclear weapons and the South Koreans having nuclear weapons, I do not suggest the same for Europe. I continue to think that Europe, the EU, is actually the European Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, and I think that Brussels is probably in a race to see if they can out-Moscow prior to 1991 under Soviet communism. I see the EU as so bloody destructive. This is anecdotal, but when I was in Croatia several years ago, I can't tell you the number of people that I ran into who not only were very resentful of what the EU had done to their economies. For instance, Croatia lost its entire shipbuilding capacity to South Korea, and I think that was part and parcel of the European Union and the rules and regulations that they imposed on the country that failed to keep them competitive. But they loathed NATO, they loathed the taxes, they loathed the regulations, and they loathed, most of all, the surrender of their national principles of self-determination, because all that self-determination had been erased by the EU. I consider the EU-SSR to be a red menace in the next generation or two, possibly a menace that is Muslim-dominated. As a matter of fact, it's one of the reasons why I am hoping that we have an on and off switch for those few nuclear warheads that the Royal Navy has, so that we can simply switch them off once they fall into Islamic-dominated hands. Again, I may lose a few listeners here, but I am absolutely opposed to any kind of Muslim presence or influence in the West. I happen to think that not only is patriarchy a key feature of successful Western civilization, but is a key feature of successful Western European Christian civilization. It is Christendom, whether you are a believer or not, that has given us this fantastic 200-year run after the Enlightenment and the Renaissance of a civilization that not only has technological dominance, that not only, for the most part, embraces free and less regulated markets, but delivers the kind of individual rights that no other architecture or political archetype in Earth's history has delivered. And of the 52 Muslim nations around the world, I think 49 or 50 of them are totalitarian shit pits. So I do not want that in the West. And if you do, well, that's your decision. I feel myself losing listeners by the minute, but nonetheless, we will press on. What is the Monroe Doctrine? Well, the Monroe Doctrine is the original 1923 policy of preventing European colonization by taking a more offensive interventionist approach against what they would do in the Western Hemisphere. Fast forward almost 200 years, believe it or not, to the Monroe Doctrine, as it is called. I love this word. It's a portmanteau coined for President Trump's aggressive, pragmatic reinterpretation of the 19th century Monroe Doctrine. It reasserts U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere to counter the influence of China and Russia, unapologetically prioritizing American economic resource and geopolitical interest. For those who don't know, having traveled to Panama with my bride several years ago, we discovered that the new and improved Panama Canal, yes, there is a secondary canal there, was built by the Chinese. We also found that in travels throughout Central America, to include Costa Rica, that many roads that we traveled on were Chinese roads. We've discovered in my wife and I's vacations when we've gone abroad, for instance, when we went to the Philippines, that they had these very, very expensive malls, very nicely done, with all the expensive motifs and shops one would expect at the tonier places in Europe and America for shoppers to buy that $2,500 handbag that is made for $46 in Italy proper or wherever the Italians who originated the bag had gotten it from in China or Africa. Well, they're all over the place. Well, the Filipinos like to go there because it's air conditioned, but they're not spending a lot of money. The Filipinos are employed in those shops, sometimes by the dozens, standing about looking at their phones and not really selling much. It's a twofold initiative by the Chinese. The Chinese go in and they provide loans under which the fine print in these very sophisticated contracts dictates that not only do they have you on the hook for paying back those loans, but if you were not to pay them back on time, that they would actually own the ground on which they had built said thing. There were massive ring roads and highways in Costa Rica. As a matter of fact, I think one of the main north-south arterials is built by the Chinese. It's built by the Chinese to facilitate the shipping of their stuff, the exploitation, expropriation, or even purchasing, if one wants to be gentle about it, of extractive resources in said countries. They're very forward about this, and this is one reason why in the continent of Africa, militarily, it is now dominated by the Russians, not the United States, and economically, it is dominated by the Chinese and not the Americans. The American nadir in Africa probably took place in the 1990s and hasn't recovered since. So let's cut our losses around the world. Let's close these hundreds of bases around the world. Let's withdraw from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And let's take advantage of some other things that this current administration has cannily done. Now, whether this is 3D chess, 4D chess, whatever the fact may be, here's one observation that I have about Greenland. I suspect that the current president did what he did in Greenland to force NATO to look at their own pockets and dig out their pocket change and start approaching the percentage that they had agreed to decades ago. Since NATO was formed, and it should have been stopped in 1991-92, and America should have withdrawn from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization for all the good that it has done us, we have spent tens of trillions of dollars defending the Europeans from what is now an enigmatic and, practically speaking, almost impossible invasion by the Russians. Because remember, it's the Russians who suffered invasion under Napoleon. It's the Russians who suffered invasion in 1942 as a result of the summer festivities by the Germans called Operation Barbarossa, in which they invaded Germany and, like Napoleon, discovered that General Mud, General Dust, and General Winter were probably the largest value added in the Russian military arsenal of all. I did an entire episode on Greenland, so you can go back there and look at that. But basically what it comes down to is this. America, through the 1951 Defense of Greenland Agreement and the 2004 Igaliku Agreement, has what one can say is a carte blanche capability to build and augment whatever bases they wish on Greenland proper. Now, the reason I'm talking about Greenland is because I think that a direct withdrawal from NATO and leaving them to their own devices is not only in America's interest, but it also allows us, through Greenland, to finally secure from Chinese and Russian missile advances and technology a kind of frontline anti-missile frontier that could be erected to actually defend the American homeland on that side. And of course, if we were to go over to the Pacific Ocean, what we discover is by allowing Japan to have nukes and South Korea to have nukes. Taiwan, we talked about that. Maybe, maybe not. That is for minds greater than mine in diplomatic wrestling and looking at the second and third order effects of doing such a thing. But all of a sudden, as a result of that, and as a result of retreating to the Western Hemisphere, America can not only reduce its spending, it can stop participating in these wars of choice that empty out the treasury and even our unborn grandchildren who will probably continue to pay for the GWAT well into the second and third quarters of this century, it allows us to finally concentrate on what we should do, which is defending the homeland. Now, defending the homeland would include, at long last, we start to say to Latin America, let's reduce regulations, let's reduce tax burdens, let's reduce tariffs, let's do all of these kind of things where all of a sudden we have an economic cooperation zone here in which, through peaceful exchange and cooperation, we can see who builds the best goods, who provisions the best services, and who comes up with the best and most effective pricing strategies for these to determine who stays in business and who doesn't. I think in so many ways, this is the primary means of finally getting America back on its feet. Stop the wars of choice. Stop the overseas adventures. Stop the intelligence color revolutions planet-wide, in which, from the Shah's installation in 1953 and what that led to, and all of the other unintended consequences that have made American security and the world so much worse off, we can stop it. Now, does this mean that the American intelligence community can stop poking its head through clandestine means and color revolution means in other people's business to all of a sudden do this? And as I mentioned earlier, Newton's third law is a stone-cold motherfracker when it comes to this, and we have paid penalty after penalty after penalty and not seen it stop. That's fodder for another episode as far as the American intelligence community is concerned. As you know, I'm super fond of robust analytical efforts to include red teaming so that decision makers, when they take their decisions, can have the very best intelligence analysis available to them to inform their decisions so that they can examine the worst possible case scenarios, the most idyllic case scenarios, and those which are the most practical. I happen to think that the clandestine efforts of the intelligence agencies are what has made the world not only a dangerous place, but it has also encouraged the kind of government supremacism, and I use that as an umbrella term for socialism, communism, Mussolini-style state corporatism, National Socialism, whatever the case may be. It has done nothing but given fuel to the fire for government supremacists to, dare I say, reign supreme around the planet and what they do. And I think that is most destructive to human liberty. So this has a variety of implications, if not inferences, in that if one were to withdraw from these treaty obligations in Europe and modify the treaty obligations in the Pacific, because I think Europe is too far gone. I don't think there's any way for the EU-SSR out of Brussels to negotiate or frame any agreements that are beneficial to the United States. And now all of a sudden we have Canada cozying up to China, because I wouldn't say that Canadians have communist tendencies, but I'd certainly say that the entire political class of the Anglophone world, which would be New Zealand, Australia, and the UK, and Canada, have a penchant for government supremacism. Remember, it was the United Kingdom that didn't stop rationing food until 1954. It was the United Kingdom that, under the sway of Fabian nonsense at the turn of the 20th century, all of a sudden spent all this time during the 20th century trying to create the bestest and most progressive, liberal, government supremacist socialist framework in Europe, and it has failed miserably. Germany is done. Germany volunteered for the Morgenthau Plan. If you don't know what that is, look it up. You'll be amused. France, because of their influx of migrants, and I would say to speak fairly to this, that since 1962 and their abandonment of their Northern African holdings like Algeria, they have had a tremendous number of immigrants come there that have not positively impacted the French culture. And of course, of recent times, we're seeing this air conditioning thing going on there. They have been in pursuit of this green agenda across the continent that has destroyed not only their industries. I mean, the German government has essentially destroyed all of the brilliant industrial manufacturing and automotive manufacturing in that country, possibly for good. They managed to destroy 3 working nuclear power plants because they were virtue signaling that nuclear power is fill in the blank because they don't like it. I don't understand that at all. I'm a big nuclear power advocate. I am not a believer in anthropogenic climate change, but I do think if you want to be friendly to the climate, there's no friendlier way to generate lots of electricity than nuclear power. But the Germans, and by the way, if anyone can run nuclear power, it would be the Germans in an effective and efficient fashion. They simply denuded themselves of all capability to do so. And they will suffer the consequences in the coming years and decades. And they will be a demonstration project of what happens when you hitch your political wagons to something that is absolutely scientifically indefensible. There's a joke around there, a riddle that I heard the other day where it said, why aren't the Chinese concerned about climate change? Because for those paying attention, sure, they're building green energies, but they're also building coal plants and all the rest. The reason the Chinese aren't concerned about the environment is because they already have communism. I want a renaissance for America. I want our GDP accelerator pedal to hit the metal. I want Americans to be able to build the things that they wish, to buy the things that they wish. I wish for them to do it locally, but if they don't do it locally, I wish for them to confine it to the Western Hemisphere. Imagine what an economic boost it would be for Latin America, from Tierra del Fuego to the Mexican border, to be able to not only have that free trade zone that was erected in the 1990s, but to have the ability to know that America has its back. And it doesn't only have its back by erecting these left-wing kleptocracies throughout these countries that simply, on almost an African model, develop these corruption architectures at the top that do nothing but despoil the country, ladle it with taxes and regulations that absolutely stop any production or productive capabilities. So this would be a renaissance in so many ways. It would be a way for America to finally stop these wars of choice, for America to finally take its most reliable allies, like Japan, like South Korea. Notice I didn't mention a single country in Europe because there are no reliable allies there, and reconfigure and reimagine how we approach the world by making ourselves localized to where we live and not where we don't. So if you want to call it the Monroe Doctrine, which of course would speak to the narcissistic needs of the current president, that's great. I don't mind that at all. But if we find a way, even if we call it that, and I love that word, portmanteau, if we do call it that, why don't we do what it says? Why don't we become regional hegemons? Why don't we become, as a matter of fact, because of the luxury of being a regional instead of a global hegemon, finally defending the United States, finally defending CONUS, finally defending Alaska. I didn't say Hawaii because I don't want them anymore. I think that we should give Hawaii to the Hawaiians. Well, Hawaii to the Hawaiians and the Japanese. Maybe we can make a deal where it can become a Japanese prefecture, much like Okinawa is. I think that that would be a most satisfactory agreement. Having lived in Hawaii for 4 years and being a white man, they do not like haoles, and it is a dangerous place to live. And I guess this sticks in my craw. It's probably the most anti-Second Amendment state in the Union. And that's saying something when you have New York and California. So, this is Bill again. If you wish to reach out to me, email me at cgpodcast@pm.me, cgpodcast@pm.me. I would ask not to bore me with that hominin name calling, even though I enjoy it, but give me solid, substantive reposts or questions, even those that challenge whatever I'm saying here, to tell me that I'm full of BS for the following reasons. I love those, because if you provide me with superior evidence that compellingly tells me that I may be incorrect, you'd be surprised that I may consider that evidence and modify or alter my position as a result of your superior Socratic skills. Again, my Substack, Chasing Ghosts. Please go there. Please comment. I love the comments that I get on my podcast that I publish. I love the feedback. Write me and tell me what you want to hear about, what you want me to investigate. What should I spend the remainder of this year looking at? And also, in other news, I'm hoping to retire in the next 8 months, maybe. I am hoping. I can't wait to quit my day job. And then, like homunculus in The Road Warrior, with Wes on the hood of his vehicle, he will release that chain, and myself as Wes, I will be free to speak about whatever I want to speak on. Please keep in mind that everything you hear in this podcast is no reflection nor endorsement whatsoever of what I do on my day job, and it is also completely unauthorized. So, love to hear from you. Hope to hear from you. This is Bill, out.